Finally, the time has come. You're getting a puppy. Or maybe you already have your puppy. But whether your puppy is arriving in a few days or already zooming around your house, you've probably wondered, what should I feed them? You scroll through websites or walk down the pet food aisle and suddenly you're faced with hundreds of brands shouting for your attention. Maybe you've heard good things about one food, but then come across people saying it causes health problems. You want to make the right choice. No, you need to, because your puppy's future health begins with what's in their bowl now. But what if it's true that some puppy foods actually lead to health problems? In recent decades, vets have been reporting rising cases of illnesses in dogs, like kidney disease, obesity, and diabetes. And studies are claiming that 1 in 3 dogs will develop cancer during life. What's going on here? It's unsettling, but some of these rising illnesses do seem to lead back to the food. For instance, diabetes. A 2020 study explored how different types of food impacted the blood sugar levels in dogs. And the most dramatic spike came from a food made with ultra-processed, starchy grains. These grains break down rapidly in the body and cause a surge of sugar in the bloodstream. Over time, constant spikes in blood sugar can lead to insulin resistance and eventually diabetes. But unfortunately, that's not the only problem with these ingredients. In 2022, 59% of dogs were classified as overweight or obese. Some veterinarians, like Dr. Nick, point to ultra-processed diets as a major contributor to excess weight gain in dogs. And in a 2020 survey of more than 4,400 dogs, those fed mostly dry food were significantly more likely to be overweight or obese. Obesity can cause a lot of other health issues too. A major one being cancer, because fat tissue produces inflammatory hormones that fuel cancer cells. So it's very possible that ultra-processed starchy grains are contributing to many illnesses that dogs face today. But how common are ultra-processed starchy grains in dog food anyway? Well, let's look at some popular puppy food and find out. Okay, this ingredients list includes corn, chicken byproduct meal, corn protein meal, animal fat, soybean meal, barley, ground rice. Ingredients like corn protein meal and ground rice are considered processed because they've been broken down through grinding, heating, or chemical extraction. So it looks like this food does have a lot of processed starchy grains. And remember, ultra-processed starchy grains can spike the blood sugar. So if we look at a glycemic index chart, corn and rice are some of the fastest grains to raise blood sugar. So if you want to start your puppy off on the right food, you might want to avoid this brand. But maybe this wasn't the best food to look at. Some dog owners say this is a cheap brand. How about we look at a food that's advertised as higher quality? Let's look at this popular brand that's veterinary recommended. And they even have a puppy recipe. Okay, I see chicken first, then we have brown rice, whole grain wheat, chicken meal, chicken fat, whole grain corn, whole grain oats. Wait a minute, this food has a ton of similar starchy carbohydrates as the cheaper food. So even though this food is recommended by vets and more expensive, it looks like it has a lot of similar ingredients. Actually, these starchy carbohydrates are in tons of dog foods. Why is this? Well, the reason why they're added is actually pretty plain and simple. Grain-based ingredients are cheaper than meat and other animal-based ingredients. And above all else, the food needs starches to bind everything together during processing to make that signature shape. Without them, the food would just fall apart. I think it's also interesting to note that according to the National Research Council's Nutrient Requirements of Dogs and Cats text, which is the gold standard for canine nutrition, carbohydrates, which include grains, aren't even listed as a requirement for dogs. This means a dog's body doesn't even need grains. Okay, so is there a food that doesn't use ultra-processed grains like this? Well, if you're looking through the pet food shelves, you might notice some bags that say grain-free. maybe this is what we're looking for. If we look at the ingredients list, we see... no grains. This is good, right? Well, according to the companies that produce this food, there are several benefits to feeding this to your puppy, like no ultra-processed grains that spike blood sugar and cause weight gain, lower risk of allergies or digestive upset caused by grains, and it provides more protein. Well, this sounds good, and that's what a lot of pet owners were saying too. However, a few years ago, after grain-free foods started gaining popularity, troubling reports began to surface. Many dogs eating this food started showing signs of heart issues, and sadly, some dogs even began dying of dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM. What could have caused this disease? Some studies suggest it's caused by the ingredients that replaced grains, which allow them to use the grain-free label. And those ingredients are legumes, like peas, beans, and lentils. These studies state that certain compounds in legumes make it harder for your dog's body to absorb nutrients that the heart needs to stay healthy, and this can lead to DCM. So, grain-free foods that contain legumes may not be the best option for your puppy either. Is there any good dry food out there? Well, many brands are popping up that don't use any legumes and also use far less starchy grains than other dog food. For instance, food like this. This food has no legumes, but it does contain whole spelt and whole oats. These are grains, but they're minimally processed and lower on the glycemic index, so it's less likely to spike your dog's blood sugar. It also contains more meat and fish, which is great because canines thrive off meat in the wild. Now, if you want to avoid all grains, you can go a step further and feed a food like this. It's shelf-stable, full of meat, organs, and seafood, and has no grains or legumes. The only catch is, it's pretty expensive. Okay, so we have a few good dry food options now, but there's one important thing to keep in mind when it comes to dry food. They can be very dehydrating for your puppy. According to Guardian veterinary specialists, without enough water to flush out toxins, a dog's kidneys can't function properly. And feeding wet food increases water intake and supports their kidneys. So maybe canned wet food is a better option. Canned wet foods are 70 to 80% moisture. This means your puppy is actually getting a source of hydration with their meals, not just from their water bowl. How much moisture does dry food have? 6 to 12%. So if you're feeding dry food, you might want to add water to it. Most canned foods will still include some grains or legumes, but if we look at this canned food, it actually doesn't have any. So this might be a great option. But before you grab a ton of wet food for your puppy, you might want to check the price because canned foods can get expensive. Let's compare prices of this wet food with its dry food alternative. To figure this out, I looked at the feeding instructions on both foods for a 5-month-old, 25-pound puppy. The wet food recommends feeding about 3 cans a day, and the dry food suggests 2 cups a day. This 4-pound bag has around 18 cups of dry food and costs $27.99 total. That's about $1.56 per cup. And the wet food costs $47.88 for 12 cans. That's about $3.99 per can. This means that you would be spending about $3.12 a day feeding the dry food and $11.97 a day feeding the canned food. That's pretty pricey. And to top it off, canned food is cooked at high temperatures and ground to mush, so it's still processed food. If you want to feed something less processed to your puppy, gently cooked food may be a better option. This is a popular gently cooked food. And look, you can actually see the pieces of meat and vegetables in this food. Gently cooked food is much less processed than dry and wet foods. But even with this food, we're running into a similar issue that we had with dry food. Quite a lot of starchy carbohydrates and vegetables. Sure, these ingredients are more fresh, and the recipes do include more meat, But things like peas, lentils, potatoes, and rice still take up a good chunk. Why? Well, a few reasons. First, it's just a cost-efficient energy source. And second, grains and vegetables resemble ingredients that we might cook for ourselves. So it creates the impression that the food is healthier, and pet food companies know this. Okay, but what if you don't want any plant-based ingredients in your puppy's bowl? What are you supposed to feed now? Is there even a moisture-rich food out there that doesn't have starchy grains, vegetables, or legumes? Actually, yes. It's called a raw diet, and it's made of raw meat, bone, organs, and sometimes fish, eggs, and shellfish. Now, I understand that feeding raw meat sounds a little intimidating, but it's important to know that raw meat, bones, and organs are what canines ate long before they were domesticated, and it's what their wild cousins naturally thrive on today. What's interesting is that many dog owners who switch to raw notice things like a softer coat, better digestion, and cleaner teeth. And those who started their puppy on raw food also report that they grew up healthy, resilient, and had a strong digestive system. I know this because I started my puppy on raw food at 8 weeks old. But it's not just my puppy. A 2023 study from the University of Helsinki looked at 4,600 dogs and found that those fed raw diets early in life had significantly fewer digestive issues later on. On the flip side, those fed dry food had a much higher risk. So if you're curious about raw food, these are some good brands to choose from. Not all of them provide puppy recipes, but brands like Viva Raw do. However, if you're like me, you may want to have even more control over what goes into your puppy's body. So there's always the option of making a homemade raw diet for your puppy too. That way, you can choose exactly what goes into your puppy's body and know where it came from. It's also much cheaper than feeding most of these high-quality foods I just showed you. But how do you make a homemade raw diet for a puppy? Well, this video will show you exactly how to do that.